Okay, buongiorno. Hello, thanks to be here and welcome to the Italian Geographical Society. The themes of colonialism, post-colonialism and decoloniality, and also the decolonial thought are all extremely significant and important for us. We know that geographical society themselves have also been a colonial tool. It is a theme that cannot be ignored and on which there is still a great deal of work to be done. The project that will be presented here and that SGI is very happy to support deals with the relationship between history and colonialism, but not only history, however, because the colonial question is intertwined with the landscape and territory. And therefore, it is an absolutely relevant theme for the present. Colonialism, we know, is not only and not so much an historical fact, but even more an ideological discourse. So to understand the representation of colonial landscapes, I think we need to understand the structure of the colonial thought. Are colonial landscapes to be considered an opportunity for tourism, or do they somehow contribute to keeping alive the colonial past in a sort of legacy of colonialism? Full elements of colonial landscape over time have been re-signified and have taken on a proper and different spatial sense. These are some of the questions that personally arouse my curiosity, even if I don't know if they played a role in the research. After all, the legacies of colonialism are many, and not only material, but also, perhaps above all, cultural. If I may be a playful reference, even the language we are speaking in, or at least in which I am trying to speak, can be considered a colonial legacy. In the project presented here, which focuses on Ireland, the themes are linked to tourism and perception. We know how important it is for tourism to build the imagination, the sense of places and their interpretation. So it will be really interesting to follow the path traced by the researchers here, who, if I understood correctly, will also put us in relation with museums in a situated perspective. The project also has a dimension connected with communication and with education, as the secondary team will tell us. As we will hear, very young students and their perceptions are involved, and there is also a theme of cartographic representation, if I understand well. The Italian Geographical Society warmly thanks for their collaboration the Technological University of Dublin through Teresa Ryan and Oxford Brookes University through Giulia Rossetti. We also thank the colleagues who attend here to share their operational and scientific experience on the topic covered by the research. Follow me a special thanks to Valentina Albanese, member of FGI board and professor at Università dell'Insubria, for having proposed and coordinated this interesting project and for having organized this presentation here in the Palazzetto Mattei in Villa Celimontana, an heritage itself. So please, Valentina, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice President. Thank you very much for your greetings and for this rich introduction. Thank you also for the support to the whole Geographical Society, and we are very proud of this project. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for being here in presence and virtually. I especially thank the people who have decided to contribute to the discussion today on this project that we are very fond of. This event today will be divided into 3 parts. after the primary team of the project, composed by me, Teresa Ryan, and Giulia Rossetti, we will hear from two members of the secondary team, Gianfredi Pietrantoni and Davide Pavia, who will help us in the realization of the outputs. And finally, from the colleagues who will offer us their expertise and experience to better refine the research. The first part of this morning is to tell you what we want to do and what we have done so far. The project is called Representations of Colonial Landscapes in Irish Tourist Attractions and was born from the idea of observing on the part of those who create content for tourists how the landscape, colonial and non-colonial, is narrated. We know that the media and schools, also museums and other tourist attractions, play a central role in the intergenerational perpetuation of patterns of interpretations and evaluations. The individual and social construction of landscape can, on the one hand, have an emancipatory role character if it succeeds without domination. On the other hand, it can also contribute to the stabilization of the unfair conditions because it can be shaped as an expression of the so-called affirmative culture. This is also strictly linked with the symbolic power, as Bourdieu and Passeron define it in 1973, any power that succeeds in asserting meanings and asserting them as legitimate by obscuring the power relations underlying its power is symbolic power. So, linking this brief theoretical framework with the concept of landscape, here I am thinking of Benedetta Castiglioni, former coordinator of the landscape research group virtually with us today, and whom I thank. She wrote that landscape is not given. It is socially produced at three levels: social, individual, and material. And these levels can be influenced through social power relationships and their spatial and physical manifestations. Educational institutions present a part of systematic socialization. Educational institutions are also, not only, but also tourist attractions as museums, objects of this research. The first space of mediation could be the discursive transformation of material landscapes into tourist objects. This space of mediation provides specialist knowledge of consumer expectations and key icons of places that form the dominant ideological foundations upon which discourses of place are constructed. Visual materials occupy the second space of mediation. Becomes a highly selective process as photographers directly mediate landscapes using photographic techniques, knowledge, and artistic expertise to convey atmospheres, moods, sense of place, feelings of place, capturing consumers' attention and encouraging imaginative interpretation. Design and the final presentation of images in brochures occupy the third space of mediation. This is about the secondary data collection that we did. As Morgan and Pritchard wrote in 1998, image construction never starts with a blank canvas, but builds upon the culmination of historical, social, economic, and political processes. So we will use mostly the social dimension of landscape in this study, which is about socially available stock of information, knowledge, and emotional conventions. It regulates the communicable and non-communicable aspects of landscape. We know, as Kuhne wrote, that we have 4 dimensions to conceptualize landscape. One is precisely the social dimension of the landscape we mentioned above. The other 3 are the individual landscape. It refers to personal emotional references to the landscape. Then we have the physical space dimension, and it's about material objects of landscapes observed by senses. The third dimension, or the fourth, it depends, concerns the physical landscape where social, individual, and material converge. We explicitly draw this research in a triple theoretical framework in which we include the social constructivism, the autopoietic system theory, and the discourse theory. In the social constructivism theory, landscape is a construct of social negotiation process. In the autopoietic systems theory, landscape is an object of social communication observed by the scientist. Trained in this theory, knowledge is produced from knowledge, communication from communication. The discourse theory refers to the hegemonic interpretation of landscape, understanding the power structures underlying landscape discourses. The phases of the landscape socialization, not strictly temporal phases, are 3 as follow. One is about the creation of a native regular landscape. Another one refers to the stereotypical formation. The third, which is a so-called optional phase by Kuhn again, is about landscape-related training, which involves the internalization of certain landscape-related spatial knowledge stocks. All of these phases constitute the dominant pattern of appropriation of scenic interpretations and valuations. So again, we can assume that landscape is not given. It is socially productive at the 3 levels: social, again, individual, and material. And these levels could be influenced by the narratives that are built and shared, not only, but also in tourist attractions. Indeed, critical landscape theory highlights several processes of domination. One of those is related to the process of socialization. In this process, social landscape interpretation and evaluation models are transferred into individual landscape awareness. Any deviation from these standards would result in the loss of social recognition. The fact that a sanction as negative as the loss of social recognition is present results in a complication of the development of alternative models useful for interpreting and evaluating the landscape. This is very important. For this reason, tourist attractions also play a central role in the intergenerational perpetuation of knowledge and interpretation models. In tourist attractions, we can find significant information about the strong current issue in this field, the moralization of landscape. It is about the everyday high significance of landscape. So we have visiting attractions, experiencing, walking, etc. Landscape is linked to emotions. Aestheticization takes place along social stereotypes, which in turn experience normative and moral validation. processes of what can be understood as landscape are complex, and physical structure known as landscape are very complex. In tourist attractions, the production and presentation of everyday place-based histories represent a form of social memory. And here I'm quoting Bill and Wallace et al. In this scenario, the production of representations, as Hannah wrote, contributes to the production of space. Hannah wrote that tourism maps contribute to the production of tourism spaces, and also they contribute to the reproduction of identities. This is why we will produce a story map, a digital story map, as an output of this project. For geographers delving into the geographies of memory, remembrance has a shared dimension, and to this shared dimension, we need to add the social nature of how space is produced that we discussed earlier. In this way, museums and heritage sites could be considered as place of memory. Therefore, following Ryan and Quinn, we are still interested in how content managers interpret difficult memories in heritage sites. Recent studies and calls are investigating the characteristics of interpreters and the development process of interpretive program. The role of storytelling and language is also included in the studies, and Massimiliano Tabusi was told about that before. To this, it should be added that that recent heritage studies have identified a shift in tourism consumption practices, which seems to be in response to a growing demand for immersive and interactive experiences, largely induced by media and technological advances. For these reasons, museums are obliged to proactively research their collections to understand, present, and interpret the histories of collecting the colonial past and the legacies of colonial period empires for the colonial present. So, concluding my speech, the conceptual framework we selected is linked to the strong question of memory and its trajectory in the present discourses. As Alderman and Inwood wrote, heritage has become a global industry that sells the past to promote tourism and development. Quoting Jorgensen, colonial heritage has become an increasingly popular tourist attraction internationally, and where colonial heritage is used in tourism, it is inseparable from cultural politics, as Hall wrote in 2009, and a wider political context given the significances attributed to such legacies. Also, colonial heritage is inherently contested, negotiated, and renegotiated in the context of contemporary debates and politics. Decisions have to be made concerning the use of such heritage for tourism. Decisions have to be made regarding what will and will not be represented as significant. My speech now is ended, and I will give the floor to my colleague Giulia Rossetti of the Oxford Brookes University, and following the decolonial approach, the whole fieldwork part will be presented by Teresa after Giulia, who among us is the only Irish woman and therefore has the authority and the right outlook for this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vale. Can you hear me well?
Giulia, if you want, you can take the floor.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you very much, Valentina, and good morning, everybody. So
sorry, Giulia. Maybe we have to turn up the volume. Possiamo alzare il volume? Just a second.
Sure.
Prova?
Yeah. All right. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Much better? Okay, great. Thank you. So thank you very much. So after having seen our theoretical concept and theoretical background, so let's focus on our research project. As you can see here on the slide, on the title here, this is our main research question, which is how do visitor attractions, and we are going to focus on Irish visitor attractions, so tourist attractions, considered as heritage landscapes, how can they interpret and narrate colonial history? So we have two main objectives, as you can see here. So the first one is to fully understand how stories are told in these visitor attractions, meaning to understand the representation and narration of this colonial history in Ireland, especially understanding and exploring the tools, the ways, the means that the stories are told and interpreted, such as, for instance, via visual or text, or verbal or written means and tools. After exploring this, our second objective, research objectives, is to fully understand the decision-making process that is behind the rationale why stories are told, how they are told in these Irish visitor attractions. Our research project, as Valentina was saying, is divided into two stages. So stage one is the one that we are actually talking about right now, where the primary research team is involved, meaning it's an in-depth qualitative exploration of 6 Irish visitor attractions. And our main objectives, the main aim is to explore, as we were saying before, how Irish colonial history is narrated and represented and interpreted. Stage 2, which also involves the secondary research team, and we will talk about this also later on after our presentation, focuses on the creation and share of this virtual story map with schools and students. Next slide, please, Vale. Thank you. So just to understand our methodology and methods, as you can see here, our research philosophy underpinning is social constructivism, as Valentina was mentioning before. We also adopt a qualitative approach, which includes several different qualitative methods, such as, for instance, participant observations, and we have already started to collect data by observing some sites, some tourist attractions. Meanwhile, doing participant observations, we also collect, and we've started to do that, visual methods, especially in forms of pictures, photographs, and this is particularly useful because it's going to help us to fully understand, as we were saying before, how stories are narrated through, such as, for instance, interactive models, projections, text, labels, visuals, graphic media, but also lighting, for instance. We have already started doing some in-depth semi-structured interviews with these visitor attractions managers and organizers. And finally, we will use some secondary data, especially in terms of these visitor attractions websites and brochures. Next slide, please. So here they are. These are our 6 research visitor attractions that we include in our research. So it's important to point out that at the beginning of our planning phase, we actually included only 2. And after, meanwhile, we were working on this research project, we were able to include other 4. So I'm not going to sorry, I'm not going to cover them all.
Sorry, Julia.
just to mention them, it's all right. So the first one is the Dublin Castle, which is a very historical site. Teresa is going to explain them later on, meanwhile presenting our initial findings. The second one used to be a prison. It's called Kilmainham Jail. It's now a tourist visitor attraction. The third one, it's called GPO, which stands for General Post Office. So it's actually a post office, which also includes a museum. Number 4 is a very recent museum, the Epic one. Number 5 is literally a ship, like a boat. It's not used as a ship anymore. So it's a tourist attraction called the Jane and Johnson Famine Ship. And the final one is Guinness Storehouse. Thank you, Vale.
Thank you, Julia. I leave the floor to Teresa.
Good morning, everyone, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here this morning to present on our initial findings from our project. And I come to you from two perspectives. First of all, I'm Irish, as Valentina has explained to you, and I should be presenting in Irish, as you quite rightly pointed out, but it might cause some difficulties for us. So I'll stick with English for now, unfortunately not Italian. But I'm a researcher in tourism, so I come with a tourism perspective to the project as well. So I bring those two ideas to the project. So just to give you a little bit of background to Ireland, not a lot of people know that Ireland was colonized, or certainly in modern discourse, we don't think about Ireland as a country that's been colonized. We don't have the markers of colonization that we stereotypically think of. But indeed, we were colonized for over 700 years by, first of all, England and then Britain. We only got independence in 1922. And the legacy of this very much lives on in our physical buildings. You can see from the quote here on the slide that it lives in our street names and in our built heritage. And also this part of our past, this tangible and intangible part of our past is very much imprinted on our tourism offering. So many people come to Ireland to see aspects of this history that still remains today. So it's very much part of our tourism offering. And something that we were interested in was this idea that, it's only after independence in 1922 that Ireland and the Irish state as we know it today had the power to decide how we represented ourselves to tourists and to outsiders visiting Ireland. And so we were interested to see how are we doing that and what stories are we telling and why those particular stories. So that was one of the things that was underpinning our research. And more recently then, we've had a decade of commemorations from 2012 to 2022, which has been commemorating major parts of our history, some of which are very significant to our colonial past. For example, the 1916 Easter Rising, the War of Independence, the Civil War, etc. And some of these are very emotive, very close to us still in terms of history. It's very recent history. But also the rise in nationalism that we've seen in England, Brexit, all of these things has called into question again questions about our legacy and our connection with England today. And of course, we have conversations happening now again about United Ireland. They've never gone away, but they're very much to the forefront again today. So it really brings to the forefront this whole idea of Ireland as a former colony of UK and what legacy we have and what it means in today's society. So it's really against this backdrop that our research is positioned. So as Julia said to you, we have 6 sites that we've been undertaking research, but I'm going to present today on 4 particular sites: Dublin Castle, Kilmainham Jail, the GPO Witness History Museum, and EPIC, the Irish Immigration Museum. So I'm just going to talk to you about 4 of those sites. And there's 3 themes emerging from our initial research, which is how they are represented and interpreted for visitors, the symbolism and symbols of the sites and that are represented in the sites, and also decision making, so power and agency with regard to decision making. So this just shows you the 4 sites, a synopsis of our 4 sites. Sorry. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about each of them. So Dublin Castle is very, very significant. Dublin Castle was the epicenter of British rule in Ireland. It is where the British monarchs representative in Ireland ruled all of Ireland. So this is hugely significant, very, very powerful in terms of symbolism, as you'll see later in the presentation. It's a very, very complex and contested site. People come there with different ideas. Some people come there with no knowledge whatsoever of the significance of this site. Many tourists come there without that, and many of them leave without that also, might I say. And, you know, so it is a very contested. Others might come with some knowledge of that. It is a state-owned site, and it's managed by a state-owned organization called the Office of Public Works, the OPW. It's a very, very significant tourist attraction. Most visitors to Dublin, to Ireland, will want to come to Dublin Castle. It will be in the top list of visitor sites to visit. The second one that I'm going to present on is Kilmainham Jail. And as Julia said, it's a former prison. It was opened back in 1796. It opened as a county jail for the Dublin area. And it's a site, very significantly, of the imprisonment of many political prisoners in the struggle for independence, and also the execution of the 14 leaders of the 1916 Rising. It closed down in the 1910-1914 period, and really it stayed stagnant for quite a period of time because the government didn't know what to do with the site because it was so contested. It had such a very, you know, political connection with our past, and so it sat until a group of individuals, voluntary individuals, came together in the 1960s and decided to restore this. They rented the site from the state for a very small, very minimal amount of money, and they restored the site because they wanted it to be maintained as a national monument to those who had died for Ireland. That was very significant in what they wanted to do. They ran it as a museum for a little while. It was a very, very strong political tone to the presentation of the site at that point. And then it was handed over by them to the state in the 1980s and has continued as a tourist site since then, open to visitors. And again, that's also state managed by the OPW. The GPO Witness History Museum is one of our newest museums, and it opened only in 2016. It's significant in particular because it very much focuses on the fight for independence, the Civil War, this aspect of our history. It came about because of the decade of commemoration. The government has wanted to leave some lasting legacies of our decade of commemoration. And there's 7 key projects, and this is one of the key projects to remember. A reminder is the idea of the legacy project. So it's one of the reminder projects. It's managed by Shannon Heritage, which is a semi-state, so partly government-run organization. They're a more commercial body. They've more of a focus on tourism and running tourist sites than perhaps the OPW would have. It's a slightly different focus. And then EPIC, the Irish Immigration Museum, is quite different because EPIC is actually a privately owned, which is very interesting. It opened again in 2016, a relatively new site, and it's a not-for-profit. It is owned and run at the initial investment of about 15 million in this site by an individual businessman who bought the building, which is a Georgian building in the Dockland area of Dublin. And he decided that the idea of a genealogy project was being sought by the government back in 2013, and he wanted to be involved in this project. The government project didn't happen, so he decided to open this. He is an immigrant. He was from County Down originally, and he left Ireland, obviously, and has become very successful. So he wanted to tell the story of Irish immigrants, the reason why they've left, but also what they have achieved internationally. So it's quite a positive tale about what Irish people have left since they immigrated from Ireland. So they're the 4 sites that I'm going to focus on just for today. So I'm going to take you through the story of each site and what we see in each site as we visit them. So the first one is Dublin Castle, and Dublin Castle offers both guided and unguided or audio tours. So you can actually travel through Dublin Castle, and quite a lot of people do when they visit there. They decide to just go through the castle themselves. It's a very, very what we would call traditional approach to interpretation, very factual. It's very understated, very nuanced, very it's quite low-key presentation, I suppose, is a way to say it, with conscious of the idea that tourists are coming. They don't want something that's overly political, perhaps. They're enjoying their trip to Dublin, so they want to come to Dublin Castle, get a sense of the history, but without being inundated with perhaps a very strong political story. The colonial, the fight for independence, post-independent context are all referenced in the building, particularly in the images that you come across as you pass through the building. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But they're very much referenced and discussed in relation to the building, to the social fabric of the building. So the balls that happened there, the viceroy who lived in the building, and the very important people, the monarchs coming to visit the building. So it's very much that. There's no real attempt to situate it in the context of what was happening in Ireland outside of the walls of the castle. It is very much about the fabric of the building and the social occasions of the building. So it's a very careful rendering of the narrative. Now, the guides, if you take a guided tour here, they do have agency, so they will influence the narrative. So the narrative, if you take a guided tour, could change every time, depending on what guide you get. That they will tell, they will focus on what. So for some, it's the art, for some, it's the architecture. Some might focus more on the political side of things. But again, it very much depends on who you're talking to. They also offer temporary exhibitions on occasion, and it's through those temporary exhibitions that you might get more nuanced stories perhaps told. But again, the content of those can differ hugely. So the second attraction that we've looked at is Kilmainham Jail. And as I said, this was built in 1796. And Kilmainham Jail, jails, I suppose, by their very, nature, are very complex and difficult sites. And there's a lot of contestation about how jails should be interpreted and presented to visitors in general. And certainly that's the case with Kilmainham Jail. It's had this very contested, very difficult history. And it too offers guided tours. The site is very difficult to navigate. It's quite old, so they will only offer guided tours from a health and safety perspective. But also in talking to the managers of the site, they feel that this is the best interpretation of the site, that people want that human interaction with the guide, and that the guides, again, can influence the story depending on who is in their tour, and they can focus on different aspects of the story depending on what they're interested in. So again, this is very much a history of the jail and how Irish events affected the jail. So it shows, you can trace the social history of Ireland in the jail. So for example, the Great Famine in the 1800s in Ireland, you see that the numbers of people, particularly children and women, increased in the jail during that time. A lot of them committed crimes so that they would go to prison because they were sure to get fed in prison. So we can trace this social history. So there's a very, very powerful connection between the prison and Ireland's colonial past. It is impossible not to talk about the politics of Irish history when you're here, because this is a site during the War of Independence and during the Easter Rising, where the leaders of the rising were brought and were executed. And it was that really led to the War of Independence, which was the beginning of the Ireland's independence. So again, they also have a permanently themed exhibition of displays, and that allows for more nuanced depth of stories again, and they offer specialist tours on occasion. And a quote there from our interview is that they said that we're very conscious of visitors coming here from overseas and from Britain or even Ireland. We don't want them feeling guilty. We don't want them to leave feeling guilty. They're on holidays. We don't want them feeling upset. So we're very conscious of that. And they said about, we tell the guides, be careful of what you say. So they are very conscious of this idea that we have a lot of British visitors come to Ireland. A lot of them don't understand this part of the history. And they are very conscious of that. So they temper down the language so as not to make them feel uncomfortable. The GPO Witness History Museum is a very, very different type of museum. So the previous two are what I would call quite traditional interpretation. Guided tours, very typical of what we understand, I suppose, from the past type of interpretation. The GPO Witness History has come about, as I said, because of the decade of commemorations. This is a much more contemporary approach to interpretation. It's multi-sensory, very, very immersive. And Valentina mentioned how tourists now want this immersiveness. They want this interactivity. And so this is responding to that need or to that desire from tourists. It tells the story of key events and how they shaped modern Ireland. So you get very in-depth understanding of all of these key events in our history that led to where we are today. And it brings us right up to modern times. So, emphasis on the 1916 Easter Rising, the War of Independence, the Civil War, and right up to the peace process in 1998. And even into modern times now, thinking about how our relations with Britain is changing because of Brexit, etc. So it's very multifaceted, very multi-nuanced, and they can do that because the use of technology allows a visitor to engage to whatever depth they want to. You can focus and get a lot of detail on particular areas, or you can just go through and pick very particular parts and, have less kind of engagement with the stories. So, it doesn't offer guided tours except for groups. It's unguided audio tours again. So again, the interpretation is through all of these videos and representations that you see throughout. And then EPIC, the Irish Immigration Museum, again, very, very new, opened in 2016, primarily offers unguided audio tours, again, a very multi-sensory site, huge technology here, a massive investment in technology. It walks us through the idea of, Ireland has a history of immigration and, the reasons why Irish people have emigrated and are still emigrating today. So it's very contemporary. They take a very thematic approach to interpretation. And the central theme to the interpretation is the influence of the Irish diaspora internationally. So, why we have left, but how the Irish have influenced the world and what they have done and how they have succeeded in the world. So it is this very, very particular story that's told. Multiple means of engagement here again. We see actors, film footage, touchscreen technology, very interactive, very engaging, very, very immersive. And we see as we walk through the different themes, there's about 22 different themes, but all of the time the stories connected with this kind of past part of our history about British rule, and that really comes through. So you see themes such as religious and political persecution is spoken about as one of the reasons why people would have left Ireland. Poverty, the famine again in the 1800s, the Great Famine, again is spoken about as reason. The oppressive laws, the penal laws at the time, the oppression from those, and the political prisons bringing right up to the present day or the more recent history. So it is patterned through the different themes as we walk through this particular exhibition. All right, so that is really looking at how these sites are interpreted, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit about. So, you're seeing there two different approaches, the more traditional approach and then the more contemporary, responding to the different needs of tourists, but also responding to the different needs for how to tell these stories. How do we give these more nuanced stories? The symbolism and symbols in the site are very, very important. These are crucial. Some are interpreted, some aren't. So really to understand the symbolism of some of the things that we're seeing, you would need them to be interpreted. You could, as a tourist, pass through and not realize what it's representing. To think about, first of all, really, the buildings and the sites themselves are hugely symbolic, each of them in different ways. Dublin Castle, the stronghold of British rule, the epicenter, the point of which all of Ireland was controlled, hugely significant. So that building itself is massively significant, but not everybody coming as a visitor would understand that. Kilmainham Jail, this was the symbol of the penal practices of colonizers at the time. It also is symbolic for the price of freedom, the price of independence. This is a site where we saw the leaders fighting for freedom executed. The General Post Office, the GPO, this was the headquarters at which the Easter Rising, which was the beginning of really, you know, the independence, the significant event that led to independence. And this was the headquarters for that Easter Rising. So it's massive symbolism in terms of Ireland's fight for independence. If you stand outside the GPO today, I don't know if any of you have ever been there, and if you look at the columns, I took Valentina to see, you can see the gunshots, you can see the bullet holes in the columns outside of the building. So that whole building is imbued with that sense of that particular time in our history. Epic itself, the building it's located, and the location where it is in Dockland is very symbolic, is that this was the departure point for many people, many of whom emigrated, particularly during the Great Irish Famine. And that is a very deeply emotive part of our history that people still find it difficult to talk about, because, you know, it was such a traumatic time in history, and people still, it's very contested still as to why that happened at that particular time. So it has huge symbolism in that particular case. I'll just bring your attention here to the quote on this screen, and this is Kilmainham Jail, and this is Stonebreaker's Yard, where the site of the point of execution for the leaders of the Rising. And this was written in 1995 by Cook, and she said, just as women and men have been made into heroes through imprisonment, so can their places of confinement be exalted by their presence. In this way, mere places of detention for criminals are transformed into power symbols of political freedom. And so for me and for other people, when we visit these sites, this is the symbolism that it holds. But it differs depending on who is interpreting this particular site. It's very interesting as well to look at some of the symbols that we see as we pass through these sites and that tourists are presented with. These are pictures that we took in Dublin Castle. And on the top left, your left-hand corner, this is just one of many paintings of the Viceroy in the building. Underneath is the throne, which the monarch, George IV, sat here, Queen Elizabeth sat here. You know, this is hugely symbolic. But I think what's very interesting about here is that as a tourist, you can come upon these, and the only interpretation is a little label underneath telling us this was the Viceroy, his name, and the period of time at which he was the Viceroy. But what did that mean? What was the symbolism of the Viceroy? I don't necessarily know. So the interpretation of these things is very muted. There's very little story being told here about, well, what do you mean by the Viceroy? What's significant about that? And we see this happening right throughout Dublin Castle. The throne, we hear the guides talk about how it was very high for George because he was big, for King George, and the legs had to be cut for Queen Elizabeth. We know that it's a throne, but again, this is massively significant. But again, there's very little interpretation. These rooms and these symbols are quite muted as we pass through Dublin Castle. I took a photograph here of St. Patrick's Hall because this particular room is hugely symbolic. But again, you can walk in here and say, this is a beautiful room without understanding why it's symbolic. At one end of the room, you have the top on the right here, the symbol for Queen Victoria's reign. It was a particular banquet that was held to commemorate her reign, in particular in the 1800s, hugely symbolic. And that is positioned. It's not interpreted in any way, it just is there. On the other end of the hall, we see the painting that's underneath, which is a recent inauguration of an Irish president, Uachtaráin na hÉireann. So that is a symbol of modern Ireland. They're in polar opposites of the room. They're not interpreted other than to tell us this is the president being inaugurated. This is a symbol of Queen Victoria. Interesting for me in particular, and we were talking about this, is that in the middle of that room is the site, the point at which in 2011 was the first time that Queen Elizabeth visited. It was the first monarch to visit Ireland in 100 years. And she came, that was a hugely significant point for every Irish person that she visited Ireland. There's no interpretation of that. You know, perhaps a guide might tell you, perhaps not, but even so, you know, you could pass through without understanding the significance of these places. Equally, when we pass through some of the other sites, Kilmainham Jail, Stonebreaker's Yard, the guide will tell you that this is the point at which the leaders of the rising were executed. It's marked by a simple cross. It's hugely emotional. That site, even if you didn't know the history, when you stand there, you know that something significant has happened here. So this is very, very symbolic, that site. The use of maps, and this particular map, Valentina took a photograph of, and it was interesting how we each took different interpretations. This shows partition in Ireland. So today, the 6 counties that are still governed by the United Kingdom, and then we have the Republic of Ireland, the 26 counties down here in green, which is the Republic of Ireland. So we still have, you know, that divide, that partition in Ireland. So these maps are very powerful. They're very authoritative in their symbolism. And, you know, we look towards map to tell us a lot about a country. And this speaks very loudly of Ireland in terms of its political history. In Epic Museum, we see the use, and Julia mentioned the use of lighting and the use of language and words. And we see as we pass through the museum, the use of words like here to your left, oppression, which was symbolism of what was happening during that period back in the 1800s in Ireland, when Irish people were oppressed by their colonizers. And we see those symbols as we pass through. So it's telling us something. So there's massive emotional significance and symbolism right throughout the sites. And they're just an example of some of the things that we came across. So the third thing that I wanted to talk to you about was the power and agency, which is very, very interesting, I think. So the memories that are presented here is, as Valentina said, these are all carefully selected, carefully interpreted, and carefully presented. The traditional approach means that the power, you know, of the OPW, for example, their remit is to protect and conserve primarily, and to make the sites available to visitors. They don't think in terms of tourists necessarily. And so their approach to interpretation here is often quite low key. It's often, you know, quite muted. The site speaks for itself a little bit, with a certain level of interpretation. Shannon Heritage, who then managed GPO, have a very different approach because they are very conscious of tourists. They're very conscious of tourist numbers. And so they want engagement and they want tourists talking about the site. And they want that immersive. And so we see them selecting and curating in a much more contemporary way in the GPO and making these more, you know, nuanced stories available to the tourists to really immerse them in the site. And then Epic, what's interesting about Epic is that the owner of Epic is part of the story. So he is presenting from his own history. He is an immigrant. And so he wanted to come back. He's been hugely successful. And he wanted to come back and tell that story of the success of Irish immigrants. So he is very much intertwined in the story that's been told. So we see huge power in terms of the story that's been told, the decisions being made about, and the reasons why they're being made, coming from very different perspectives. The tour guide, as I've mentioned to you already, in Kilmainham Jail and also in Dublin Castle, has agency. They have to follow certain stories that they tell. They have certain areas that they have to address, but other than that, they have agency to focus on the different aspects. So the story will always be different and always nuanced in favor of what they are interested in. So as I say, it could be about the social history, it could be about the architecture, it could be about the political nature, but it would very much depend. But there's also agency of visitors as we travel through the site, particularly those on the guided tours. They'll ask questions, they'll challenge the narrative. And so we see them all the time, that guides having to manage this contestation, particularly people come with particular agendas. And we spoke about this and they said, we're conscious of that. And that's why we will always say, we're not here to tell the history of Ireland. We're here to tell the history of the building. So we focus on the building, then we don't have to deal with that difficult, history or contestation. So we see that. And, you see just some quotes here from our research. We say certain things you have to speak about. There are things that cannot be overlooked. and staff have a little bit of leeway to bring on whatever elements they're interested in once it's factually correct. And you could go on a tour today or tomorrow. You could come back, say 2 weeks time, and get a different guide, and then you get a very different story. So the interpretation is changing all of the time. So this is forever. So just in terms of trying to visualize what's happening here a little bit, if we see approximately 1960s, we don't have an exact date for when Dublin Castle opened as a site, but Kilmainham Jail 60s, and certainly it was around that time. Very traditional, very muted, very careful rendering of the story, very conscious of the visitor, and conscious of avoiding contestation, issues that could cause offence or upset to the visitor. So it's quite a neutral rendering of the story in many cases, unless the guide depends to maybe give it a different flavour. Very much the agency of the guide there at hand. More recently, we're seeing a change, a move towards this more contemporary interpretation, and that allows for this much more multisensory and multi-dimensional. And the agency then is given back to the visitor to go through the site themselves, and also to engage whatever level they want with the different stories, so they can get more of a history of the stories being told. So slightly different approaches. Okay, so I just wanted to kind of frame it a little bit at the end. There's a lot there. What are we seeing? Well, Irish colonial history is very present in all of these sites, but it underpins all of the stories being told. The GPO focuses on the fight for independence up to modern days, but it's underpinned by the story of colonialism. And that gives it meaning. And it's the same with all of the other sites, that it is very much present. But the methods through which it's interpreted differ significantly. You know, this traditional muted approach versus more contemporary. So why is this happening? We're seeing this changing tourism landscape. Well, it is definitely happening, as Valentina pointed out, because of the agency of the visitor. They want this more immersive. They want these authentic stories. And they want to get to grips with the understanding of these sites. So we're seeing a move away, perhaps, of this very traditional approach to these more multisensory engaging. And so there's a response to the visitor, but there's also something happening in Ireland, that we are now 100 years, we've just celebrated 100 years of our independence. So perhaps we are coming to a point when we are now ready to reclaim some of these stories, that we are ready now, that perhaps we are now willing to talk about some of the stories that we have. It's only very recently, I was just explaining to Valentina last night that at the weekend there was a newspaper report about, you know, there was the first commemoration by the state of the Irish Civil War, because just last week, because this is just too recent. It is too difficult. It's too contentious. And so it's only now that we're beginning to come to terms with some of these stories. However, what's interesting outside of this is to look at something like Dublin Castle, which is so significant and it is so important to who we are and our identity and what we've become, is still very muted in its interpretation. It is still not really telling that complex story. And you could, as a tourist, pass through Dublin Castle without really understanding the significance of that building. So we're seeing quite different approaches. And so there is a reluctance. We're seeing that we're reclaiming 1916, our fight for independence, how we've moved on, how we've become modern, the peace process, where we're going in the future as a modern society. But there is a certain reluctance to think about and maybe to talk about the fact that we were colonized in the past. And there's a certain amount perhaps of shame still in our history of claiming that part of our history. And so we don't really speak to it directly. And I think we're seeing that in some of the sites as well. So that just gives you a synopsis of some of our findings to date. And I'm just going to hand back to Julia now for, she's going to talk to you a little bit about the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. So just to conclude our presentation, we would like to introduce stage 2 of our project, and then we're going to have the secondary research team to explain these later on. So after collecting and analyzing our data, as Teresa was saying, and we have started to do that as well, we aim to create a digital virtual story map with students and for the students. So it's a really interesting didactic output of our research project because, as I said before, it's in partnership with some schools as a group of students, and then it's going to be shared with other educators, teachers, and schools. It's really important because, as Valentina was saying, these landscapes are places of memory, but also our educational spaces, including younger generations. So therefore, our students. And also scholars are claiming that it's really, really important to bring our research into our classes. So research-informed teaching is very valuable, including those online virtual elements. And this goes back to our digital story map. Which is going to be a tool for students to not just develop knowledge on Irish colonial landscape, but those students that are going to be involved are also, will also be able to develop some other skills, such as, for instance, as you can see here, digital literacy, but further transferable skills that can be portable, such as, for instance, communication skills or even teamwork or time management. So now the didactic outputs in relation to this digital story map are the story map, but also this is going to be shared with some guidelines for teachers and educators so they can actually use the story map efficiently. And then we are going also to plan a didactic workshop. So thank you very much. That was the end of our presentation. And if you want, next slide.
Thank you, Julia.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation and also for the self-managed of this session. Thank you very much. My job was really simple. And now I ask if somebody here has questions or comments or online questions or comments. Normally there is a lag, so I can start with my personal curiosity. I was imagining during your presentation that obviously it's very important to consider the past of every nation, if we want to use this word that at the moment is difficult to use in Italy, for example, and to do a devil's advocate, so to say. If we say that there is a sort of suggestion to explore the past and the colonial past, isn't it the risk to be accused of a sort of nationalism, to enforce a new nationalism, for example, considering also the present situation of the re-emerging nationalism in Europe? And I say that also from Italian point of view. If you see the commercials on TV, every 2 words there is Italian from Italy. There is a sort of moment now in Europe. So the question is if this can be a problem or is not at all a problem for us, because I imagine this kind of approach in Italy, for example, and from our past. And another question, another curiosity is, normally we see that technology and new model of museums give more spaces for tourists to understand and to discuss. But sometimes the immersion in a specific new media, for example, can be more hard linked to a certain interpretation, probably, no? Because you are immersed in this kind of video, in this kind of audio and everything like that. So to curiosity and provocation, obviously not more than that. So only to start the discussion, I think we can afford 15 minutes of discussion because we have 2 speakers left on the second part of the morning, so we can afford a little bit of discussion, and thank you very much. Any other question and comments? If we collect remarks and question and comments, then you can answer if you want.
Okay, thank you very much. I have something to say for your second question, and maybe for the first question, Teresa is the best person to answer, because I think that we have very different kind of past. So maybe the risk of nationalism in Italy is a kind of risk, in Irish is a totally different color, this fact, because they need maybe to be more nationalist, to affirm their culture, but I don't want to say anything about that. I prefer that Teresa answer to that. And maybe also Julia, if she wants to say something about maybe mostly the second question, because it's close to her topic. I think that I totally agree with the thing of the immersion, because it tends to build the affirmative culture, what I mentioned before, because if you suggest a lot of ideas, images, and facts and colors and everything that goes with it, yes, you give a route to understand something. So maybe when we analyzed the Dublin Castle, we discussed a lot about the muting, because for some reason that mutation, is it correct to say it? When you mute something, how do you say? Mute, yeah. The muting, yes, it's not really fair in your point of view. No, maybe we discuss about that. But in my point of view, that muting was good for me, because without words, without stories, I just could immerse myself in my sense and in my emotions. In fact, the images in the St. Patrick's Hall, where you saw the Regina Victoria and on the opposite side, the painting of the Irish government, was something that really involved me. When I was there, I stayed a lot of time to analyze why you put this in this part of the room and this in the other part. And I appreciated that there weren't stories. She didn't appreciate it. So this differentiation maybe is the best thing that you can give to the tourist in a tourist attraction, in my opinion. So I totally agree about the immersion. It's not every time a good idea, I think.
I think it's a very difficult one, because I actually, personally speaking, I don't like all of the technology. I found some of it a little bit too much, and but my problem is that, how do you get the balance? How do you tell the significance of what people are seeing without necessarily overwhelming them as well? And there's no easy answer. This is the problem. This is why we're having these conversations. But, you know, I suppose I came to these sites with a very different perspective than Valentina, because I stood there and I thought, what does this say about me and my identity? And I walk through somewhere like Dublin Castle and I think it doesn't say an awful lot actually about me and my identity. People come here to see a castle. The first thing they see is it's not a castle, by the way, in case you haven't been there, because the castle burnt down in the 1600s and was rebuilt later as more of a Georgian building. And so they're disappointed with that. And then they walk through and they see nice furniture and nice paintings. And I say, but this is not telling enough about what this means. So I think there has to be a balance somewhere between overwhelming and too much interpretation, but also explaining or giving some sense of why this building is significant in the Irish context to those people who want to know that. Somebody might not. I mean, when I was visiting there, I could see people passing through and just taking photographs of themselves beside the staircase, and they just want to flip through, and that's fine. But others want to understand a little bit more. And my problem is that how do I find out then? How do I know about? And actually, the interesting thing about Dublin Castle is I've obviously been there in the past, but it had been some time since I'd been there. And they're doing a little bit more interpretation now than they did, because now with each room, there's a little poster outside of the room which tells you a little bit about the room. And they didn't have that in the past. But it tends to be about the furniture, about the paintings, about, you know, they tell a little bit about the Viceroy had his balls in this room. The Viceroy had his balls in the room in the 1800s when people were dying of starvation outside of the building. We don't get that sense of history. Kilmainham Jail gives a slightly better sense because it talks about the jail in the context of Irish society. So you get a better sense without being overwhelmed. There is a little bit better sense. The problem there is what sense you get will differ hugely depending on who's giving the guided tour. So I think it's a very difficult question, you know, to answer, but I feel that we need to think more about, you know, a balance and giving people the opportunity to understand more, which I feel is there. And remember, a lot of Irish people go to these sites too. It's a huge amount of Irish people. In fact, in Kilmainham Jail, the top visitors are United States, the second is Irish, and then the third is Britain. So, you know, surely for Irish people, we need to understand it's our identity. What does this mean in the context of our identity? So I think we've been very careful. We've always, as Irish people, I think we've always tread very carefully about our past. We've had to because it's very new, it's very recent, and it's still going on. It hasn't gone away. We still have issues, you know, around a united Ireland. All of this is still, so it's difficult to tell these stories. But if we want people to come to Ireland, if we say that these sites represent our identity, then we have to interpret them in a way that it gives a sense of our identity. You know, it doesn't have to be a full immersive, but I feel that it should perhaps address that a little bit more. I'm always taken by how Dublin Castle just pulls back. It gives a little, but not a lot, you know. And nationalism, as Valentina said, is quite different in Ireland, I think, but it can differ again, depending on whether you're in the Republic of Ireland or Northern Ireland. And, you know, we have very, very strong sense of pride. Irish people anywhere around the world, however small the number, make themselves heard. So, there are always issues around that. There are always, about what it means to be Irish. And, people take different interpretations of that. But, the reality is this is our history, whether we like it or not. This is our history. It has formed who we are. And so, there is a beginning. I feel that we are now looking towards this history a little bit more and to engage with it. But I think it's just really beginning in many ways.
Julia, it's up to you.
Now, just to add something very quickly and link back to what Teresa was saying in answering your second question about technologies, I would say that it's also very important to focus on what the tourists can gain from these different type of visits, because as Teresa was saying, they can tailor their visits differently if, for instance, they visit the Dublin Castle, Kilmainham Jail with a tourist guide, instead of just going to the Epic Museum by themselves, and they can choose to have an audio guide, but they can skip some audios, or they can skip some displays, or they can choose to interact with some technologies. So the visitor can actually tailor their experience. So what they gain from the visit, it can be really different from, again, what they can actually gain from visiting the Dublin Castle. So again, they both want to be educated and entertained at the same time, but the experience, how they live these sites, can be really, really different. So yes, so it's really important to understand how these stories are told and interpreted, to also fully understand how people can not just experience, but what can they learn and gain from their experiences.
Hey, thank you. Any other questions or comments from participants online or in presence? Not any, so we can proceed with the program. Thank you very much again for your presentations. And we start with Gianfederico or okay. So I invite here Gianfederico Pietrantoni, that is the web strategist of Italian Geographical Society, and also Davide Pavia from the Association of Italian Geography Teachers to continue. I have to confess that the places you mentioned, I only visit Guinness, but not the museum. A lot of Guinness places, but not the museum. So not only. Please, Gianfederico Pietrantoni, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Morning, everybody. Thanks to be here. And okay, we change a little bit now the environment. We jump a little bit into this technology and how technology can help provide tourists with or everybody mainly with the results of your project. Okay, I'm going to talk for a while, just a little while, about the story maps that have already been mentioned by Teresa and Valentina before. And I believe everybody knows everything about the story maps here, but just a very quick introduction to the meaning and how the story maps work, I think can be useful now. Okay, basically the story maps is nothing but a digital storytelling. I mean, the storytelling now is very fashionable. It's always used as a term to describe more or less everything. But anyway, there is a way to digitalize the storytelling and to give a representation of what you want to tell people that can be more flexible, more, how can I say, more, a little bit deeper than the simple wording storytelling. So basically, there was a mention by Teresa, I think, before about the importance of the maps, of the geographical maps. How much a geographical map can tell around, even though it is static and just a picture. Yes. Oh, sorry. Okay, let me repeat. There. This is yours. Okay. Sorry, I completely forgot this. So this was at the beginning and the first page. Okay, what is it? Basically, what is a story map? Is an application, is a software application, then shared interactive map with a lot of other multimedia content and text, and is able to tell stories basically, but not to tell stories with a simple text or some picture or so on. But it's an interactive storytelling because you can use maps like this. You can use text. You can use many other things, and we'll see afterwards what can be done with these story maps. So the beauty of a story map is that a story map is already ready for you to be delivered to any type of device. Now we go around with our smartphones, or we use tablets, or we use standing on PCs, or in museum, for instance, there are a lot of kind of screens that you can touch. You can a story map is designed also for that kind of use, and it is automatically adjust to the screen size and to the type of device you use. Furthermore, story maps are open source, so are available free of charge, and there are many type and many enterprise that provide story maps environments. What we use here, and this is because we are in Italian society, geographical society, what we use here is the one provided by Esri Italia, because we have a deal with this enterprise. But anyway, there are many other environment that you can use produced by other enterprise and other providers. You can you have your in this many tools are available from this environment, and you can use I don't know tools that can allow the use of the GIS systems. You can embed a GIS into your story map, link to text, link to any other type of multimedia like videos or audio tracks and so on. The use of the story maps was really successful during the last years. We go from, is the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago, there was a very, very low limit. These are data provided by Esri Italia, so it's limited to there. But you can see that there was a real explosion in the use of story maps. And why? Because they're easy to use and they're quite useful, especially in the area of the didactics and the teaching. Okay, this is a little bit of wording just to tell that you can create a real blend of things that can describe other things, then can describe environments and so on. And your narration can be based on geographical maps. This can be useful, for instance, in your case, because moving around Ireland, you have many sites, and you can link stories to sites, and you can interlink sites with stories. So if a story applies to more than one site, you can have 2 entries or 2 links that can show the virtual unity of this of these sites. And as a matter of fact, this is a new way of telling geography, geography and whatever is around the geography. That is almost everything. Okay, so these other words, I would jump this so I can leave much more time to my colleague here. So in the Italian Geographical Society, we decided at a certain point to use story maps. Why? Because basically we had 3 basic assumptions. The first one was it is an efficient and effective tool for educational purposes. I mean, and this is something that we have then demonstrated. It was demonstrated by the use that has been done both for giving education and for receiving from whoever was educated. And it's a valid support for teaching geography and dealing with interdisciplinary topics. As I was saying before, in a story map, you not only have a geographical approach, you can have a time-based approach, you can have an history-based approach and other type of approach. I mean, as a matter of fact, it's a multidimensional environment, and you can decide where to get into, how to exit from the environment, and how to move inside the environment. And then it's quick and simple to use. This is fundamental. There is nothing magic in setting up a story map. A little child can do it, and also an old and how can I say not ready to change professor, university professor that is there since 1915 and is still there, but can use it. It's quite easy. Okay, now I would like to give a very, very quick tour on the use of the story maps in our environment in Italian Geographical Society. So basically we had, this is our, how can I say, library of story maps. Then we have story maps that we produced for teaching purposes or didactic purposes. And this is a story map that I picked up as a kind of example of what can be done by a primary school. I mean, we are talking about children, boys, from 11 to 14. So really, really young, and without particular skill. So this is our, now I'm going online. I hope it's quite fast. Okay, it is. So this is our repository of story maps. This is our site, the site of the Italian Society. As you can see, we have many, many different type of for instance, this is nice because it's a young did the final exam for the how do you say maturità in English? I don't remember now. Okay, it's the end of the secondary high school. At the end of the secondary high school, there is an important exam, and he did the exam. He produced the exam using a story maps, for instance, and presented it to the commission, having a lot of success, and his son. Okay, and so on. You see, there is a way to go around in the continents. There is this history, basically, it's the history of an area in just near Rome, and so on and so forth. Okay, okay, this is very nice because it was performed by a group of very, very, very young foreigner children that, as a matter of fact, they did just designing the things by hand, and then I think from 7 to 10, something like that, and they were able to do it. And I mean, you know, and I know that now children are very, very smart with all the technology. But anyway, this is really surprising, astonishing. Okay, and so on. So this is our library. You can see we have a lot of things here. Okay, so let's go back. At a certain point, there was quite a big project here in the SGI that for the education with the I would say IT support, information technology support, and this project was financed, I don't remember by whom, but anyway, it's not such a big problem. And okay, but journalists, and we produced a number of story maps for different level of education of school education, school levels. And for instance, we have here that deals with the geography of Dante. And then this is a kind of guide to the imaginary locations. I mean, everybody was, I don't know, Peter Pan, the island, l'isola che non c'è, the island does not exist. And many others. We have in our mind a lot of imaginary location. Then there is a Spasso nel Tempo, walking in the town, along the time, by the time. And this is a kind of historical and geographical story map. This is a new edition of an old magazine, but and then that illustrates a lot of travels and trips and something like that. And then I would like to show you this one because this one is very, very, very nice, and it gives an idea of the extension of the possibilities that story map can do. This has been designed for very, very young children from 3, 4 to 6, 7 years old. And okay, let's go and see it. Come faccio a mettere l'audio? Ce l'ha? Ok. Oh, ascoltiamo Gaia. Listen to Gaia. Gaia is the old name of the earth. And you see, it's organized in different chapters with all the environments that we normally see in the world, you know, on our earth. Is the sea, the top of the world, I mean, mountains, the strength of the nature, everything is strong in nature. Then the giants of the earth, and is the basically trips and so on and so forth. You see, so we can start with everybody to the sea. Everybody goes to the sea, and you see there is some text, there is a picture, and then there is also. Can you hear the sound of the sea? So the children can follow whatever is going on. And then you are here. There is of course there is why if you use a shell and you put the shell in your ear and you listen to the sea and so on. Of course you can have better images and then to the top of the world. This means that we have very high mountains, and again you have here, and then there is a K2, the K2, which is the second highest mountain in the world. And if I don't hear you, go ahead. What? Ah, yes, yes. And you listen. You can listen to the wind at the top of the mountain, and so on and so forth. I mean, this is something that has been produced here. For instance, here there is the volcanoes, and this is the recording of the Etna. While and then of course there is some picture, some movie. And so on and so forth. I mean, we can go on. At the end of everything, there was the Niagara Falls, the deserts, and there is also the sound of the deserts here. It's a very, very low-level sound. Anyway, at the end of everything, at the end of the story, there is a kind of quiz, and the children have to tell who is the picture that is linked to the specific sound, and it's a kind of it's a little trick to get the attention at the end of it, because it's quite okay. This is something that can show how this technique, I mean, this teaching technique can also be used for very young people. It's not only, and how this technique can also be used in giving information about your themes to also, not only to people that can, not only to old people, but also to very young people. And this is what we have produced for teaching purposes. But this is something that has been produced instead by, this is a school that is in Salento. Salento is I'm not, I was not forced to do it anyway. I did myself, okay? And okay. There is a class of this school wanted to produce a kind of little, I'm gonna say, documentary on their sites there, and came out with this story map, which is really, really outstanding to me because, okay. Here we can see how a map can be linked to history and other things. Okay, as usual, there are pictures and text, and here we can start seeing when the beginning of the map. It can gives the itinerary of the story. Then here it is the first site, and here we are in the map. So if I want to go somewhere else, I can get it, or here, and I can get it. See, this is the way to, this is the explanation, this number set, point number 7. Of course, we have this.
Questa è tutta zappata, queste fosse che state vedendo sono tutte raccolte.
They have done.
Non è facile.
This is the story of another city, and of course, again, I can move here around the locations and see whatever. There is another move here. Okay, all this has been developed by these young people. Again, I think it was the third class. Second, so 12 years. 12, they were 12. So, amazing. Well, having said so, I think we can I can leave the floor to my colleague. And if you have any question, I can answer. Please, otherwise.
Okay, maybe we can collect questions at the end of the session. Thank you very much. It's for your very interesting presentation and a lot of work for those story maps. Not only maps, as we have seen, music, sounds, pictures, and not only maps. And this is an important way to strengthen geography to children and people. And maybe the Italian Geographical Society worked a lot about that during the pandemic period, and this is a way to improve services to our associates. So thank you very much. And now I ask to Davide Pavia to take the floor. He represents the Italian Association of Geographical Teachers. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Good morning, everybody. And thank you very much to the organizer for inviting me to this interesting workshop. So my name is Davide Pavia, and I'm actually a research fellow at Sapienza University of Rome, where I've been studying geographic information systems from the beginning, since I was a student. And today I'm here on behalf of the Italian Association of Geography Teachers, an association that was founded in 1954 to promote the geographical education by training the teachers of all the school levels. And this is why I decided to name the presentation Teaching and Learning with Geostorytelling using the story maps at school, in order to dedicate the presentation to the powerful instruments that we talked about it just a second ago among the fields of education and also the didactic. So let me start by introducing the parts that I divided this presentation. There are 3 parts, like 3 chapters, and the first one is going to focus the attention on the tool of story maps, trying to relate this tool to the broader framework of geographic information systems, pointing out some of the central features of the tool. Then I'm going to dedicate the second part to the applications of the story maps in the fields of education and didactics, and talking about the advantages of using this tool in this kind of fields in the school environment. And lastly, the final part is going to be a brief presentation of a couple of projects that were held by the association that I'm representing using the story maps for the teachers and for the students. So first of all, I'd like to start framing the story maps into the broader world of GIS, because this tool can be considered like a sort of son of a broader technology that known a constant and progressive evolution development from its beginning. And indeed, the great potential of geographic information systems was already clear to whom is recognized as the father of this technology, a person named Roger Frank Tomlinson, that wrote this kind of feeling in an article that was published in 1962, and that can be considered the one that started the works on the Canadian Geographic Information System, which is considered the first one of the world. And it's interesting to remark that if this article is the first one that has been written on this topic, this year, today, we celebrate the 60 years of geographic information system. That is an important anniversary. During this year, the 60 years, the tool was constantly developed. And this was a process that involved all of the components that later David Maguire stated to be the fundamentals of a geographic information systems, that are the hardware, the data, and the software, and also the users. So while the first three components are related to technical aspects of a GIS, the last one listed by Maguire belongs to the human dimension of the tool, that is to say, the people that form the community of user that uses this technology, from which depend the research of new capabilities and also the applications of the tool. And as I said earlier, all these components known a constant development among these years. And this is what happened also to the fourth dimension, to the fourth component, the one of the users, thanks to the presence of a broad series of user-friendly apps that you can use directly from the internet. And this is exactly what happens with the story maps. So to better understand the capabilities of this tool, I'd like to start talking about the platform and the architecture of the platform where the story maps takes place. That is the ArcGIS platform. So the platform as a central core, the core part of the platform is called the portal, and is the instrument, the way that the user can publish their contents on the web and access to the contents of the others. So this is the portal, and the portal, in order to be the way to access these contents, needs to be supported by a series of backend services, like the servers, for example. So there are no interaction between the users and these backend components like the service and the servers, because there are a set of client apps that the user can use in order to do so, to make this access. And the story maps are one of these client apps that can be accessed both from the web and from a mobile device in order to create geostories and to publish them on the internet. So since 2019, the application look like an empty canvas where the users can, for example, type a title and a subtitle, change the theme of the application, and also add some of the resources that are listed in the panel of the left of the slide. And these resources include, for example, maps and images like we saw before with Professor Pietantoni's presentation. Although the template selection is available right here, the story builder of the new website is pretty different from the previous one that is also known as the classic story builder. This precedent website started with a selection of one of the 7 templates available, such as, for example, the map tool one, the map journal one, and the cascade one. And it's interesting to see that this classic version of the application is still available, despite the fact that the newer version is online. And this is probably why, because of the importance of the templates themselves, which are one of the most interesting and powerful features of the application. Depending on the template, the layout of the story maps change, but not just that. Also, the contents and the topic that you can use for telling the story can change according to the template. And from a didactic point of view, the choice of a template may also affect, for example, the activities that you can decide to do with the students. And we can make an example about it. For example, the students that are working with the map tour template can be divided in groups dedicated to different study areas to work on them, while the students that are working on a map journal template can be still divided in groups, but to work on the same study area from these different perspectives, for example. In a way or another, the story maps have proved to be valuable resources at school, both for the teachers and the students, because of various reasons that were pointed out by several researchers in these years. In brief, we can remark that this tool, the tool of the story maps, is useful to encourage the students to learn the spatial thinking and also to learn the geographical knowledge. And this can happen for 2 basic reasons from my point of view. The first one is that the story maps can help the students comparing places that can be really different, really distant from each other, not just in space, but also in the time dimension. And the other capability that I think is really interesting is that these instruments can help the students form their personalities and their self-awareness by giving them the chance to create their own product and to present them to the rest of the classroom, for example. These were the objectives of 2 projects that were held by the Italian Association of Geography Teachers that were focused on the use of story maps at school. So the first one that I like to cite is called Story Maps at School, Teaching and Learning, Stories with Maps, and the results of this project were published on J-Reading, which is the name of the journal, scientific journal of the association. So this project took place in 2014, and one of the purpose of the project was to train the teacher to use this tool, the ArcGIS story maps, a tool that at that time in 2014 wasn't famous like it is today, if we consider that the first story map of the world was published only in 2011. So the project was participated by more than 60 teachers from different subjects and different cities, such as Florence, Rome, and Turin, for a total amount of students that reached the number of 1,800. These ones, the students, were then asked to produce story maps regarding, for example, their school's projects, the school trips they made, and also the neighborhoods around the schools where they go, where they live. And some of the stories were later presented during the Italian conference of Esri Italia of 2015, and some of them are available in the Geo Observatory, which is a website of this enterprise, which link is written in the article if you want to know them, if you want to take a look at the story maps that were produced. The second project that I'd like to mention is instead called Imparare Navigando, which means in English, learning by sailing with a boat, I mean. And you can find the details of the article published on another journal of the association that is called Ambiente, Società e Territorio, which is focused on the activities of the association and its associates. So the project was about the coastal areas of Lazio, which is the name of the region where Rome takes place. And it involved 6 classes of 3 different high schools, nautical high schools of Rome and of the surrounding provinces, for a total amount of around 100 students. These students were around 15 years old, and they were divided in 6 different groups to work on this big topic of the coastal landscape. And for example, one group was focused on the recognition and the description of the harbors that were and that are along the seaside of the Lazio region. Another group was focused instead on the relationship between the human settlements of the coast and the marine landscape, the marine environment, sorry, and so on. So each group had to create a story map at the end of the research, at the end of the work, but not just to present their results to the public, but also to collect and analyze different cartographic sources in order to reconstruct the coastal landscape and the changes that occurred during the time, during the centuries. So to conclude, the authors of these projects pointed out a positive response by the students that were especially happy to learning geography by doing something, by acting themselves. So among the other results, the one that I would like to cite, especially in the conclusion of my presentation, was the one that the students learned an important principle, an important thing, that is that a story can be told in different ways, even if the subject is the same. So a story about something can be told in various ways, depending on the person that creates it. And I found it suitable with the research project that you're leading, which involves, as Valentina told me, students not just from different schools, but also from different countries that have to work together on the same platform with the same tool. So one possible relation between these 2 groups of students can be, for example, the comparison between story maps that told about the same topic, and the topic can be, of course, the cultural heritage. So make a comparison between 2 different products created independently by the 2 groups. And another possible relation can be, for example, this one. So the Irish students can build their stories about the tourist attractions that we talked earlier, and the Italian ones can review the stories of the Irish colleagues in order to point out, because they are of the same age, in order to point out like parts that can be enhanced and describing how they will do them in the same way, for example. So these are just 2 little ideas, and I just thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity, and wish you a good continuation of the morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Davide and Gianfredi. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting. Those are more or less new, not so much new, because you told us that are instruments that just used in geography 10 years ago to now, but very, very interesting. Also to communicate the specific point of view of the geographical thought, about a lot of issues. There are any questions or comments from the audience online or here in the room? Please. Yeah, from the podium, otherwise online they can't hear you.
Now I know everything about digital story map. Now I feel very educated. So I do. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, I know you were talking about education and geography in particular, and our project is a little bit different, but I'm also sitting there with my lecturer's hat on and I'm thinking about my students and how I could engage them in some of this material, because I think it's really interesting. And one of the things that I've been trying to do, and I know that a lot of lecturers are doing, is this idea of engaging students in creating content rather than just listening all of the time. And my question to you is very practical in terms of engaging students with something like this. And I know you said it's easy, but how easy and what's involved in getting them started in something like this? Can you give me an idea?
I think it is quite easy, because you know, the attitude of young people today nowadays is very, very technological. They know how to move on a keyboard. They know how to link concepts together in order to set up a kind of chain of events. So the learning of the technological environment is quite easy. It's very, very guided, I would say. You just everybody. The beauty of these days is that these boys, these young people, are very familiar with the objects in a context. I mean, when they play some of these word games or these games that they do all together, you know, on the network, quite often they have to take objects and put inside the context in order to have a result. And this is the logical path to set up something like this. You have objects available. You have to take the object, put inside the context, link this object with something. For instance, you have the object that can contain a movie. You take the object, put somewhere into your workspace, and then you have to link this object to the movie. And then you have to decide, okay, when I click here, the movie starts. So it's not such a big deal to set up these kind of things. You don't need, I would say, developer expertise. I think these people, these young people, can do it quite easily. And I mean, and also the results we get from our experience with the classes and with the schools demonstrated that they mastered the environment in quite quickly. Yeah.
It could be a case of the student teaching the lecturer in my case anyway.
This can be the case, yes, sometimes. You want something?
Oh, yeah. Just a few words, and I totally agree with Professor Pietrantoni, because you don't need to know nothing about the language of programming to create this kind of output. It's just a drag and drop in a canvas, in a black canvas. You add the items to the canvas, and all the items, the components of a story maps are out of the box. So they are already ready for you, and you just need to pick one and drag it into your story maps to create the product. So I think that the most challenging aspect for a teacher should be not the creation of the story map itself, but the design, the planning of the story maps. So deciding and working on the contents that are, as we saw, multimedial. So there is a textual part, some images can be added to the story maps. So I think the biggest part of the work for the students is the preparation of the materials that later are going to be part of the story maps. But I think if is a work group for a classroom that work together on the same story map, the activity can be the preparation of the materials and then later the addition of these materials inside the story maps. And this is going to take some time, also because the teacher is the one that can driven the classroom in the choose of the layout, the choose of the parts that are going to make the story maps, and also, of course, consequently, the choose of the different groups that are going to work on the different materials that are going to be the contents of the instruments.
The very last consideration is that the building of a story map is just like the building of a movie. You need a screenplay, you need, if the story map has to be produced by a group, it is quite useful to give different tasks to different people. I mean, someone has to collect the things, the objects, someone has to produce the screenplay, the story, and decide, okay, we move from here to there. It's just like the design inputs of a movie. And I think that also this one can be really a good chance to learn for these people, these young people.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Waiting for other questions, I can add myself a question to you. Is there a specific role of maps in story maps? Because we are geographers and we have seen that we can have a story map without maps, basically. Otherwise, maps can be only a sort of a place to put pins on. But which is the role of the maps and which is the role of the perception of territory? Can you give specific advices to people being a geographer and studying this kind of things about maps in the solar maps? Thank you.
Yes, so the presence or the absence of a map and a story maps, I think that first of all depends from the template that you choose. Like, for example, the map journal one is a template that is pretty suitable with the absence of a map. So it's just a scrolling page that you can fill with images, textual documentations, and so on. So the map is something that you can also skip if you don't want to add it. Instead, a template like, for example, the map tour is based on a presence of the map in the central part of the interface. So in that case, you cannot avoid insertion of a map, and the map is going to be the platform where you will see the pins, and each pins is kind of a link to a content that will appear inside the template time by time, according to the use of the user and the click that the user does to the story map. And I think most of the time, the presence of the maps in the story map is just used to locate the places that later they can be described by the rest of the contents. But we don't have to forget that everything is part of a platform, the ArcGIS platform, that is actually a WebGIS, and a user that creates a story map, but can be also the same user that created before other GIS contents, like, for example, raster data, but also vector data. And all these data can be part of a work and the results of a work that can be embedded in some web maps, and these web maps can be part of the story map. So it depends from the level of knowledge of the GIS software. For example, if you have some results to show, well, you can embed that results in a map. That map can be part of a story maps as a mean of communication to a broader audience. And the nice part, the interesting part, is that the audience can interact with the contents that you published with the story maps. So, for example, if the results of your work is a vector layer representing, I don't know, the fountains of Rome that you discovered through the activity of your research, you can embed this information in a map of a story map, and the user can interact with that. So it's not obligatory, but it's of course something that you can do with different levels of accuracy, I think.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions or comments? If not, we can meet again at 12 o'clock, more or less, in 15, 20 minutes there. And here we have a coffee and online not. Unfortunately, we cannot meet together drinking a coffee. So thank you. We will see here at 12 o'clock and 5 minutes more. Okay, thank you.
C'è?
Sì, ci sono, mi sentite?
Ok, perfetto. Sì, sì, ti sentiamo perfettamente. Allora, Benedetta, quando vuoi puoi iniziare. Io mi occupo solo di dare i tempi.
Grazie. Buongiorno a tutti. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for Valentina for inviting me to chair this session. And I'm really sorry that I'm not with you there in Rome. So I am online, but I could follow very well the first part of the morning. The project that was presented this morning and the different contributions all deal with and intertwine some topics. And of course, landscape, cultural heritage, tourism, education, and the political dimension of each of these and of the different connection between them in the context of the colonial memory. I do not have any personal experience of research on colonial landscapes, but I can refer to some activities that concerning landscape and in intercultural contexts, or on landscape and education, or landscape and tourism. But I want to mention, I went back to a result of a research we did some years ago. I remember in 2018 it was. We had a survey. We could do a survey on the projects proposed by very different subjects at national level concerning education on landscape. It was a survey proposed with the Minister of Culture, and we had an answer we could survey 600 projects, so it was a large number. But it is interesting, on the one hand, that more or less 15% of them was presented by a museum. So this is one of the things that we mentioned, that was mentioned this morning, the action of museum in education. And the most important thing is that when we asked what do the projects refer to, on the one of the most item that was answered was that landscape is addressed as cultural heritage, while at the lowest level of this, the possibility of the possible answers, we found the landscape, the point of view on landscape of visitors, tourists, and migrants, and landscapes of different cultures in the world. So I think that the project on colonial landscapes and more widely, the possibility of put together on question the relation between landscape, culture, heritage in education and in tourism really is a space that need to be addressed, that need to be more considered in our researches. And if it can see, it seems to us sometimes obvious, but it's not. And we know we need to go deep inside the relationship, the interconnection between these topics, probably in front of the more recent challenges and more recent advances in the theoretical reflection. So thank you very much to Valentina and the group for proposing this really interesting, and I think the project is something that we really need as one of the possible way to go inside these topics that really need to be addressed. So now we will have some other ideas on these topics from different perspectives given by some colleagues that had already proposed researches and so some ideas on this. And so I think we can follow the list, so the order in the list. So Matteo Proto can take the floor in only even if online. So thank you, Matteo. Matteo is associate professor at the University of Bologna. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Do you see the presentation?
Yeah. Everything is okay.
Okay, thank you. So thank you very much to Valentina Albanese and the organizer. What I do today is presenting a common research project that I developed together with Elisa Magnani and Karin Pallaver, two other colleagues at the University of Bologna. And our presentation focuses on colonial heritage in Italian landscape, and specifically it analyzes the role played by statues and monuments related to colonial exploration and colonial wars in shaping till today a complex imaginary made of lapses of memory, exculpation, but also remembering and renegotiation of the past. So the paper is structured as follows. Firstly, we analyze how and why this colonial past was removed from public discourse and consciousness. And secondly, we present some case studies which illustrate some monuments that still characterize the landscape of many Italian cities. And we discuss their meaning and and their legacy, and also the conflicts that this monument often make. So the first is why this colonial amnesia. The reason of such amnesia about Italian colonialism is related to the fact that Italy did not experience a process of decolonization like many other European countries. And so there was no debate on the fate of the colonies in Italy as the result of the rise of independence movement in Africa and their right to be independent. The end of Italian colonialism was the result of a military defeat suffered by white power at the hands of other white power during the Second World War, at the time in which having colonies for European states was still normal. And so after the Second World War, there was a propaganda campaign right by the Ministry of Italian Africa that remained in place till 1953 for the restitution of the colonies. The loss of the colonies was presented as something that could impact Italian economic and something perceived as a punishment to a country that was trying to recover after 20 years of fascism and dictatorship. And so Italy campaigned with the United Nations for the restitution of the colonies, but without asking the restitution of Ethiopia that had been unlawfully invaded by Mussolini in 1936 and was then ruled by the Emperor of Ethiopia, who had returned to the throne after his exile in the UK. But then Italy campaigned for the restitution of Somalia, Eritrea, and Libya. And in this context, at the public level, a discourse was developed based on a separation between a kind of bad colonialism that occurred during the fascist regime and against a good colonialism that happened before fascism. And as we can see in the slide, this amnesia and separation is presented in a map that was published in 1961 in a school handbook of history, showing the former Italian colonial empire, but removing Ethiopia like this colony has never existed. And here, so it happened, the creation of this myth of exceptionalism of Italian colonialism as something that was done to the benefit of colonized people who got civilization with building of roads, school, railways, and so on. And there was also a kind of consent from political parties brought from the leftist and the right wing. And in this critical moment, so a selective memory of what colonialism had been was built, separating so what happened in Africa before of the fascist regime and then during the fascist regime. And as we will see in the case studies, this selective memory is still present nowadays in the Italian landscape connected to colonial heritage and colonial monuments. The first case study is the monument to the fallen in Africa, built in Syracuse. This monument was planned already in 1938 to be put in Addis Abeba, and originally entitled to Italian Workers in Africa. Its construction was interrupted during the Second World War and was resumed in the post-war period, designed for a new location that was, of course, not possible anymore in Addis Abeba, and then was identified the city of Syracuse as an important seat, as a port used during the colonial war. And so the monument was inaugurated in 1952, so well after the Second World War and the end of Italian colonialism, with the shape of a ship with the bow stretching out over the promontory facing East Africa. And it includes 6 bronze statues representing the military corps of the Italian army, the Navy, the Air Force that took part in the colonial war. And this monument is often object of vandalization with the writings, love phrases, drawings, and also damage of the marble. And several campaigns to restore the monument has been promoted by right-wing extremist group, also sometimes involving local school. And the monument attracts some attention by the media, particularly by local right-wing newspaper, that identify this place, this monument, as a symbol of Italian nation, so removing the fact that this celebrate a colonial war, and they use this place as a kind of scenery for support their political discourses on national values. And the second case study is an even more controversial one. This monument was inaugurated very recently in 2012, and it is a mausoleum in which is buried Rodolfo Graziani. What's very important is that the erection of the monument was also supported by public money with about 130,000 euros, and the construction of the monument irritated the Ethiopian communities all over the world and provoked significant demonstration both in Italy and at international levels. For example, a big demonstration was organized by the Ethiopian community in front of the Italian embassy in Washington, D.C. And as a consequence of the erection of the monument, the mayor of Affile, in which the city in which this mausoleum was built, and two other councillors of the municipality were sentenced to 6 and 8 months in prison for apology fascist regime. Who was Adolfo Graziani? Graziani was the general who, under Mussolini, lead the campaign for the coast of Libya. He was then governor of Somalia and then took part to the war in Ethiopia using chemical weapons against the civil population. And after the he also took part to assassination of Ethiopian resistance, between the killing of the monks of the monastery of Debre, Libanos, with about 1,500 to 2,000 deaths, and because of that, he's known as the Butcher of Addis Ababa. And after the war, the UN Commission for war crimes included him in the list of war criminals, and Ethiopia asked for his extradition, but this, of course, never happened. The last case study I present is focused on a monument inaugurated in 1906 in the city of Parma to celebrate in his hometown Vittorio Bottego, a scientist and explorer whose tragic death in Africa made him a kind of national hero. The bronze and stone monument stand in front of Parma railway station, and Bottego's statue dominates the war memorial, and especially two other bronze figures, two male warriors of the Oromo people, an Ethiopian ethnic group, which should represent the Omo and the Juba rivers, two rivers explored by Bottego during his field trips. But as many scholars have suggested, we could argue that these people also symbolize the submission of African people and African lands to the white European explorer and conqueror. And Bottego's figure is well connected to the engagement of Italian government also through the foundation of the Italian Geographical Society in building an overseas dominion. In 1895, Bottego drove an African expedition with a very tragic end. An expedition that was part of a broader exploration plan promoted by the Italian Geographical Society. And with this expedition, the Geographical Society aimed to facilitate Italian penetration in the region of Somalia and in the Horn of Africa more broadly. And Vittorio Bottego led 2 of these expeditions in Somalia to explore the basin of Omo and Juba rivers, and during the second one in 1897, he died in a clash with local soldiers. In fact, this dramatic conclusion revealed that all these expeditions were characterized by a military nature and were imbued with political goals, all elements which caused trouble with local authorities. And the scientific interest of the exploration was merely the propaganda used to conceal the real goal of the expedition, that was to foster Italian expansion into those regions. But so beyond monuments and memorial commemorating explorers, national heroes, the age of exploration produced a complex narrative based on scientific accounts, travel reports, pictures, that also thanks to the initiative of cultural and educational organizations such as the Geographical Society, was spread in the society, thus contributing to forge a colonial and imperialist imaginary. And this rhetoric myth of the explorer, of the neutral scientist, pushed by the interest of knowledge, went well beyond the period of Italian penetration and the Italian colonial war in Africa. And also due to this imaginary still embedded somehow in the Italian society, in recent years, the monuments of Bottego was restored and then relocated in front of Parma railway station. And on this occasion, there was not any concern or discussion about the meaning of the monument and its connection with the history of colonization, despite the fact that since the last decades of the 20th century, some historians have started to discuss also Bottego's legacy in the history of colonialism. And as we can see in the quote above the slide. However, in the last 5 years, a different perspective had emerged and consolidated, brought from grassroots experiences and at the institutional level. And here we can see 2 examples. On the one hand, a local educational initiative promoted in 2017 by a cultural organization that organized an urban exploration aimed to revisit the heritage of colonial age in a critical perspective. And on the other hand, also thanks to the impact of Black Lives Matter and other recent mobilization at the international level, the Parma City Council discussed the political question of Bottego's monument legacy, with the decision to preserve the monument for its historical value, but to provide some information that can situate Bottego's role in the age of European imperialism. And so to conclude this presentation, despite of the protests and the effort of reinterpretate colonial heritage in the context of 19th and 20th century imperialism, in many occasions still today, this issue is still very problematic in Italy, also due to events and declaration of public figures. In 2021, a statue was dedicated, for example, in Genoa to Giorgio Parodi, a businessman that was a founder of the factory Moto Guzzi, but also Parodi was involved in the fascist conquest of Ethiopia and in the bombing of Addis Ababa. And that, as we can see in the statue that was then vandalized shortly after its inauguration as a sign of protest, Parodi wears a fascist uniform of the aviation. And this recent erection of another monument to a colonial hero drives parallels to public declaration of Italian politicians that are still reiterating the myth of Italians as good colonizers without any involvement with the cruelty and the criminality of of colonialism. So I finish, and I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Matteo, also for staying in the time and keeping the time. Thank you very much, and for this inspiring contribution. So I give the floor to, I think we go on with the three intervention, and then we can have a discussion at the end, I think. Okay, Valentina? Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much. So I introduce Tania Rossetto, my colleague, associate professor at the University of Padua. Please, Tania. Perhaps the camera is not on Tania, but on Valentina and Davide.
Just a moment.
If it is possible.
So thank you for having me. It's always a privilege to speak at the Geographical Society. Please consider that I prepared this presentation based on the project summary we received. So maybe something will appear redundant or incongruous, and I apologize for that in advance. So stimulated by the reading of your project, and in particular by its visual methodologies, my presentation today would like to open up a space to reflect on the possible implications of cartography and mapping as a component of the visual ecology of colonial landscapes at heritage sites. And indeed, following the project, your idea was to maybe something is not working because I don't see my presentations. I'm having some help from. So can you see my slides? Okay, I can proceed. And indeed, following the project, your idea was to take in consideration maps as part of the textual data collected at the attractions sites. Here, the approach is a deconstructivist one, so your aim was to analyze the visual discourses, narrations, and forms of public display produced about the colonial landscape at heritage sites, and also beyond, in related materials such as flyers or websites, and so on. In the analysis of all these verbo-visual materials, you also mention the methodology of content analysis. Yes, interestingly, you here adopt also an ethnographic approach, since your aim was to interview, for instance, who is responsible for the production of such materials, and you also took author-reflective field notes during your own visit at the sites. Well, my first suggestion here is to provide a full consideration of cartography within your visual and ethnographic materials. Indeed, considered within the category of informational images, cartography has been traditionally taken as situated at the margins of visual studies. In classical readings such as Gillian Rose's visual methodologies, for instance, maps are of course included, but definitely not considered through the lens of the multiple and rich methodologies applied to other visuals. It is worth noting then that after the critical turn and deconstructionist vogue inspired by Brian Harley since the late 80s, much of the cultural understanding of maps has been shaped by the notion of maps as texts rather than images. As Toss noted, in pursuing critical cartography, scholars have favored the verbal metaphor of the maps as texts, so that reading the map might be said to take on a new meaning, a more appropriate and significant one compared with the activity of merely looking at a map. Yet, as Laura Lopresti put it, studying maps just as texts to be decoded and dismantled is inadequate, while time is ripe to treat maps as modulations of contemporary iconosphere. That the convergence of visual culture, mapping, and cartography has blurred the epistemological boundaries that police understandings of what we might consider a map as distinct from, say, an image is increasingly acknowledged. As Papotti suggested, the contemporary sensitivity to maps forged through the digital shift has had the collateral effect of amplifying the role of alternative maps. Ludic and appealing, such alternative maps play a great part in forming contemporary cartographic literacy. Unpredictable and alluring, they call for a map reader response criticism. Irreverent and bizarre, they demand intellectual pluralism. This is particularly true for maps emplaced in heritage sites or museums, which are growingly conceived as catching, bizarre, alluring devices. Now, this complex cartosphere growingly requires so-called post-representational approaches. Post-representational cartography refers to a trend in map thinking emerged 15 years ago, which considers maps not as truthful or otherwise power-led representations, but as open-ended processes and relational events. Rather than being valued for exactness and cognitive efficiency, or otherwise being criticized and deconstructed as powerful representations and visual discourses, maps should be viewed as continuously unfolding mapping practices involving complex networks of human and non-human entities. This way of thinking of maps is aimed to open up new research endeavors focused on the broad practices of mapping rather than on the nature and power of maps. Thus, according to a post-representational stance, we should avoid the consideration of maps as mere visual discourses to be decoded and criticized. And this is particularly true in the field of tourism cartography, which has been actually the first area of cartographic study which adopted a post-representational stance. I occasionally worked on tourism maps, also at heritage sites, in a time when the current acceleration of digital navigational mapping devices were yet to come. My point was to consider how in tourism performances we enter the cartographic representation with our own body, rather than being passively driven by the map. As many critical readings on tourism maps predicted, we experience the tourism map by practicing, sensing, and embodying it. The focus on experience and embodiment is another important point that current map studies share with visual studies. Let's think about anthropologist Hans Belting's fascinating discussion of the body-image relation. There are plenty of ways in which theories such as this one could be applied to maps. Indeed, geography is experiencing a renewed attention to representations, which are considered as entities endowed with affective liveness that do rather than stand in for something. As Anderson recently suggested, the focus on the force of representations suspends an attitude of sole critical suspicion towards representations to encounter representations in open ways. He stated that after the emergence of non-representational theories in the last 20 years, cultural geography is once again concerned with representations. This renewed attention returns to a political attitude of cultural geography, namely the interrogation of the powers of representations, but proposes to stay with representations differently. Representations are considered as lively practices endowed with a creative force of making, remaking, and unmaking future worlds. To provide an example of this tension between representational and post-representational readings, in the field of cartography, let me refer to a research I carried out with a colleague from the University of Roma La Sapienza, Edoardo Boria, while we studied map making from different theoretical backgrounds and provided a dialogical account on the case study of Laura Canali, the cartographer who has created maps for Limes Rivista Italiana di Geopolitica since 1993. We analyzed the work of the map maker in order to show how critical and deconstructive reading, on the one hand, and ethnography, on the other, are better used as complementary rather than conflicting approaches. A textual critical analysis of maps was therefore challenged by the work Into the Wild. I organized a fieldwork, prepared some story facilitating activities, used video tours and go-alongs interviews throughout the city, so the cartographer could be interviewed in multiple settings, which provided narrative environments for the emergence of additional map-making stories, events, and situations. Now, this methodological mixing of discourse analysis and ethnography with maps and visuals has been adopted also in tourism research. I would like here to make a quick reference to a recent work by Stephen Hanna and others on an additional way of focusing mapping practices and tourism at heritage sites. In Following the Story, narrative mapping as a mobile method for tracking and interrogating spatial narratives, published in 1918, they present the narrative mapping method, which is a mobile and spatially sensitive form of participant observation that enables researchers to capture and interpret the affective qualities and spatial arrangements of museums' narratives. Hanna and others worked on heritage sites in the southeastern USA, studying how the history of slavery is incorporated in the landscapes and narratives of plantation museums. As they state, not only are the pasts that these sites reproduce geographically specific, but also the narratives themselves are experienced through the spaces of the museums. To date, much of the research on museums and other cultural heritage sites consists of discourse and content analysis specific to how the past is represented at a single site. Alternatively, scholars working with a post-representational framework employ autoethnography to grapple with effective responses to museum spaces. While against this background, they propose an additional mobile, sensitive, go-along methodology to grasp how visitors co-construct spatial narratives through the spaces of heritage tourism sites, and in particular, how the tours and the narratives emerging during such tours incorporate or marginalize the enslaved. So these are just some fragmented suggestions emerging from a cartographic lens. But we saw that on a subsequent phase of your project, you are going to produce your own narration of the heritage sites and of their colonial and post-colonial implications. You are going to activate a new storytelling practice, and here maps comes to central stage, since you will adopt, as we saw, Story Map as a digital tool to co-create a critical narration of the heritage sites. As you write in the project, this new narrative device is also going to criticize possible failures of existing materials in producing a deep awareness of the colonial nature of landscape attractions. Indeed, there is a growing literature on the Story Map tool and other similar applications that involve maps in storytelling practices. I would like to point out here the recent article and commentary published in the open access journal FENIA which presents an auto-reflecting account of creating a cartographic storytelling from the perspective of a research group mainly formed by anthropologists based in Vienna. First of all, they offer an extensive literature review that could be of great interest for your own application of story map. The main aim of the article is to highlight, through an anthropological attitude, the need for deep self-reflection in putting together ethnography and a story map product. Their case study is the life of two railroads in eastern Siberia, and they provide a series of multimodal episodes to represent the railroad stories in space. Here, story map is conceived as a means of knowledge and science communication, and the major preoccupation is to do justice to a decolonial approach towards indigenous and non-indigenous people in the field. With relation to this digital tool, significantly, they take in account the deconstruction of the power of cartographic tool, but at the same time, their mapping practices become an exploratory, challenging way to engage the field and present their results. They explicitly apply a post-representational approach while describing their own process of doing the colonial storytelling through maps. Here, mapping is felt as a learning process, a tentative, but also affirmative practice that centers the colonial geographical imagination by revalorizing local knowledge. To conclude, I find interesting what in the commentary to this article, Laura Lopresti wrote. A map possesses a narratological character by dint of the fact that it may allow humans to move, discuss, and feel about something beyond the actual content of its representation. However, while for writers, artists, and adherents to humanities, historical cartographies have always been considered forms of narrative, contemporary digital cartographic storytelling is still mainly addressed as a technical representational concern. Thus, only questions and problematics related to design are discussed, leaving out any possibility of experiencing mapping as a creative and critical process. So the invitation is to approach story map not just as a less or more effective technical tool, but as a post-representational practice. In some way, we could here recall many aspects I came through in the previous part of the presentation. How can we consider the visualities, discourses, narrative potential, post-representational dimension, practices, embodiment, experientiality, force, making, relationality of a story map? This is the question I leave to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. I think you have exactly pointed our attention to some of the questions that arise and that will be addressed by the project. So I think it was really very useful for Valentina and her colleagues. So now I can give the floor to Davide Papotti, full professor of the University of Parma, for his contribution. Thank you, Davide. And please, if you can move. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Benedetta, and thank you to the organizers of this seminar for inviting me. I will just offer a few thoughts that resonated in my mind after reading your projects, and I will just offer a few concepts that I think are a result of your conceptual itinerary. First of all, I would like to emphasize the necessary interdisciplinary nature of the research.
I will just start quoting the academic roles that the four editors of a recently published volume, which is called Decolonizing Colonial Heritage, New Agendas, Actors and Practices in and Beyond Europe, that is published by Routledge in open access just this year in 2022. The four editors are Britta Tim Knudsen, who is, I will read the titles and their subjects because, in my opinion, are very interesting to understand the mix of competencies and perspectives. Britta Tim Knudsen is professor of culture, media, and experience economy at the School of Communication and Culture at the University of Aarhus in Denmark. So I think the tripartition of culture, media, and experience economy is interesting. In fact, I would also like to know something more about the number of visitors to all the attractions that you selected, just to have a quantitative frame for the impact of these tourism destinations. The second editor is John Oldfield. He is professor of slavery and emancipation at the University of Hull in the United Kingdom. Third editor is Elizabeth Butner, professor of modern history. Okay, here it's a plain definition to which we are more accustomed, at the University of Amsterdam, the Netherlands. And finally, Elvan Zabunian is professor of contemporary art history at the University of Rennes in France. This was just a sort of a sample of the varieties of gazes and conceptual approaches that can be added into your research. I will just mention folk studies, for instance, as a perspective to which that would be interesting to add. Migration studies, of course, political sciences scholars and diplomacy scholars, of course, media studies scholars and museologists. So it's a very rich object of research and many multifaceted. Second point that I would like to bring to your attention, the fact that tourism imageries and colonial imageries are strictly linked in our contemporary tourism industry. Because the persistence and the continuity of colonial imageries in tourism marketing never stops to surprise me. It's incredible, the long inertia of the repertoire of images that passes with no interruption from the world of colonial heritage to the world of tourism imagery. And in this perspective, I am particularly interested and in reading your project by the processes of selection that are underpinning your choices. First of all, the selection of the places that you are investigating. And I would be curious to know if there was a larger list of places that you took into consideration, if you had to do a selection, if you had to do so, under which criteria, and what were your reasoning behind the potential selection of places to investigate. And then related to this process of selection, the issue of the context that clearly came out in the explanation that Teresa gave us about the Dublin Castle, and came out the idea, the quote that you gave of the tourist guides. We are not dealing with the larger context. We are dealing with the place itself. This brings into the stage the geographical concept of scale. At what scale are we investigating and working? Selection is a key word in tourism industry because we perfectly know that tourism marketing is a harsh selective process in identifying some icons that are particularly meaningful. And it's interesting to see the different scale of the selected destinations. Third point, I would like to no, actually, I already missed the numeric progression. Fourth point. I've always been bad in mathematics. Fourth point is the link which came out from your presentation between colonial heritage tourism and the component of what we could call dark tourism, following the definition by Foley and Lannon from 2000 in their book that is exactly called Dark Tourism, or thanatotourism, to use the definition of light in 2017, meaning the forms of tourism that are that see as their destinations places where death had been protagonist, and you have some examples in your selection of places. Here, as you pointed out in your presentation, we have a crossing of different issues. The emotional aspect that is strictly linked to necrotourism or dark tourism or thanatotourism merges into the larger issues of a political reconsideration of the history and the memory of the past. But we have also a sort of morbid component of these categories of tourism that is to be put into the larger frame. A fifth point that I would like to mention, and that was protagonist already in your presentation of the project, and also it's a perfect link to Professor Rossetto's presentation, is the component of performativity. Tourist guides, you mentioned, the idea of agency to influence the narration. You mentioned the agency of the tourists themselves. And we do not have to forget the dimension of tourism as a process, as a performance on the tourist sites. And this brings me to the next point that is linked to the technological dimension, because the duality that you presented, I was very interested in your distinction between a traditional presentation, a traditional storyline, a traditional way of assembling museums and displays, and a more contemporary one. And of course, it's an issue of technology, it's an issue of overwhelming possibilities in front that opens in front of the contemporary tourist. But let's not forget that the virtual dimension and the larger menus that a tourist faces in contemporary displays makes it even more complicated to investigate the hidden criteria through which the choices that are made available are constructed. Because in the larger menu of virtual interactive choices, we have a larger responsibility for the people who determines which are the choices. And this is a key issue in the construction, because at the first sight, we could just think that in front of a menu, the agency of the tourist is larger, but of course, the definition of the menu is a political question, and the definition of the choices. So the criteria through which the virtual exhibitions, the reconstructions, the virtual tours are constructed becomes a key ethical issues. Last point that I would like to bring to your attention is the idea of the audience, the issue of a multi-targeted discourse that is typical of the tourist production of rhetorics. To whom are the tourist destination talking? Whom are they addressing? It was interesting in your presentation that came out, the idea, well, if we have visitors from the United Kingdom is an issue. If we have visitors from Northern Ireland, it's another discourse. If we have issues from Ireland, it's another one again. What about visitors from ex-British colonies, for instance, or other areas? So I think in this perspective, it is interesting to investigate what is the ethnoscape, if we want to borrow Arjuna Padurai's term, that we are imagining in these tourist destinations. What is the ethnoscape that the creators of the displays and the tourist discourses in this destination, in these destinations, had in mind? Exactly like in architectural renderings, we put figures in a landscape, in planning tourist destinations like the ones you take into consideration. Creators have in mind a potential target and also an ideal target. And I think that this is interesting, and again, linked to the idea of how choices are constructed in the displays. I stop here and open to potential debate and questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Davide. I think it's better now the floor is someone else in the room can chair this moment of this debate, probably. Massimiliano, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Probably the colleagues may answer to some provocation or stimulation from those presentations here, from the colleagues that just presented. I don't know if you want to reply something. And Valentina, please.
Okay. Okay. I think we have a lot to think on, because about the process of selection, we at first decided to study just two tourist attractions that were the Dublin Castle and the Epic Museum, is it? Yes. Then, learning by doing, we decided to add attractions. And when I was in Dublin with Teresa, day by day, we decided to add attractions, just selecting them by the topic of the attractions. But obviously, to make more scientific the research, we have to define our criteria. So maybe we will do the process up down. We did the study, we did the primary data collection, but now we have to write down why we selected that kind of attraction. I find very interesting your idea of what is the ethnoscape, and to analyze the former colony, British colony in the Irish tourist attraction, because this is another point of view that really maybe we forget. And it is very interesting. We cited someone as people from United States, from Britain, from Irish, because when we were at the Kilmainham Jail, they told about this kind of public, this kind of visitors. So this is why Teresa cited them. But obviously, I think we'll have to think about the former colonial British colony, because this is very interesting as a point of view to add. What scale also? I think that the scale that we have to focus on is also the scale of the body, because we are reasoning on sensations, sensory geography, the sensory approach. And so this is about the body. So maybe following Tania Rossetto, because she talked about the body. And I think that this will be the best scale in this research, because we talk about emotions, sensory approach. Also, the link between the dark or thanatotourism is another important link. We consider it, yes, maybe it didn't came up very strong today, but it's in our mind. And I think I answered to the most part of your question, but thank you very much, because they were very important for us to focus better the project and the library that we are thinking of. And that's all for me. Thank you very much to you. Thank you.
Question, a very practical one. Are you going to produce a story map as, an output of your research, not just as a didactic tool? Okay. Because the presentations about story maps made reference to didactic activities, but since such narratives are so complex to negotiate, I was wondering if a story map product related to the project was also going to be.
We are not so convinced about that, because we have some routes that we are following on story map construction. So I'm not so sure in this moment. We will have a follow-up on the 15th of December with some schools that we with which we collaborate, and we will have to talk about this process of construction of the story map. But it is an output of the project in our mind. Maybe the youngest students from Italy will build a map of the Dublin tourist attractions, and then maybe this is the first idea. It could change, but now we're reasoning on this route. And in a second step, the Irish students, they will be elder respect to the Italian students, will put in the content in the itinerary. So like an improvement with two different point of views, we will have a story map with a map from Italy and content from Ireland, just to put together two different points of view, the insider one and the outsider one.
Okay, because like Davide Pavia told us, the content is the problematic thing. Then
Yeah.
the tool, of course, you have to be aware of the tool, but the content is.
Yeah, this is why we are thinking to put in communication to build a network between the Italian students, which will be from 12 to 14, with Irish students, and they will be students of Teresa. They are 23, 24 maybe. Yes, so they are bigger and they can help in the content. Yeah, to put in the content. Yes.
Maybe I can question. I don't know if Teresa or Julia may say something about the magnitude of the numbers of the museums asked by Davide a few minutes ago. My personal interest is also about the connection of your study with a national policy, if there is a sort of connection, because we are searching for a national policy in museums. And what about the connection with Ministry of Culture or the equivalent in Ireland? I don't know if there is just some connection or not. And I cannot add conclusion. I leave conclusion to Benedetta. So, I don't know if other questions or comments may be arising from the participants. Otherwise, if you want to say something about that, or otherwise I leave the floor to Benedetta, and then we can close.
Thank you. I was frantically looking through my notes as you asked the questions about numbers, because we do have them. I just haven't represented them today. But to give you an idea, one of the things that we looked at is we have Fáilte Ireland, which is the Irish Tourism Board, and they have a list of top attractions in Dublin. So this is one of the lists that we used to help us identify the sites. Dublin Castle would have in excess of 500,000 visitors per year. So it is one of our top sites. So we were looking for cultural sites rather than the zoo or, different kind of culture. And Epic would be very similar. They're very, very large numbers. GPO is quite new. I don't have numbers for those yet, but they have opened 2016. Obviously, COVID impacted, but they've been phenomenally successful. So all of those would be in the top 10 fee-paying attractions in Ireland, definitely in Dublin, but also in the top for Ireland as well. So they're quite significant in terms of that. We haven't been in contact with Fáilte Ireland or the Tourism Board. There is a tourism policy for Ireland. If I can say without sounding too critical, the focus tends to be on visitor numbers, bums on seats, value finance, rather than necessarily, they have, in fairness, they have developed, and we did look at it as part of kind of the thinking, because one of the things that I was interested in your map there was that kind of visual, and we did, for our observations, do a map of kind of key questions to walk through and answer as we were walking through the sites, and some of that was influenced by the Fáilte Ireland and what they're suggesting to these sites they should be thinking about when they're interpreting for visitors. And that, so, and in turn, I think your idea about this, the visitors of other economies, is very interesting. In terms of visitor profile, North America is top, British, and Europe. So France in particular, Italy is in there as well. And the others then would have very, very small representations. But it would be a really interesting aspect, I think, to look at. Yeah. Okay.
My question came out because I remember an experience that when I was in the United States, we went to visit Colonial Williamsburg in the United States, and there was with us a visiting professor from Royal Holloway, Peter Armour. So when we went to the entrance and we bought the ticket, it wasn't a normal ticket, but they gave you a Patriot's pass. And Professor Armour was making fun and saying, well, I don't see why they call them patriots. I would rather call them rebels. Oh, it's always a matter of point of view.
Yeah.
I do not see if there are any other interventions. No? Okay. So I tried to say something to conclude, but it's very difficult to conclude because I think it's really a morning that is widening our perspective in very, very different directions. I think that it was that Valentina and the research team was I thank them because they proposed this discussion, this open discussion, putting together different perspectives on their project. But it's very difficult to conclude because I think it's really a morning that is widening our perspective in very, very different directions. I think that it was that Valentina and the research team was I thank them because they proposed this discussion, this open discussion, putting together different perspectives on their project. So it's not so easy. Often we want to propose to present our result when they are already all is done, and we feel very, very strong on our results. So I thank them for this moment of the very open discussion and proposing us the debate over their project. And so it's up to them now to consider all the many stimulation that I think they received today. Some already on some they already, of course, have some answers, but the question on what happened and it's happening on this heritage landscape, starting from monuments, from what Matteo said us, and the question of the role of maps and of story mappings as learning processes and the post-representational practices. And then the perspective of tourism studies in the different these multi-faced questions proposed by Davide. But I think that these different perspectives are really interesting for all of us, for opening a debate on the relationship between colonial studies, landscape, heritage, tourism, and education. And really, I think we need to debate more on this. And even if it's really interdisciplinary, as Davide Papotti highlighted, it's important that we understand what is our role as geographers in this interrelation of issues. And so for myself, I go back to some reflections on landscape as a tool more than as object, and on landscape as an intermediation tool in particular. And it's not a new question, a new issue, but probably we need to update the reflection on it. And okay, this is on landscape is my perspective. Each of us has a different core on for her research. So each of us can really had received a lot of stimulation this morning. So thank you very much to everybody for this morning.